Chapter 1. The Last Normal Day. The morning of December 24th, 1987, broke cold and gray over the small town of Millbrook, Connecticut. The forecast had promised snow, but the sky remained stubbornly clouded, refusing to deliver the white Christmas that the Ashford children had been praying for since early November. In their two-story farmhouse on Blackwood Lane, just outside the town proper, Eleanor Ashford was already awake, her hands moving methodically through the ritual of Christmas Eve preparation. She had been up since 5:30 in the morning, lighting the kitchen stove to begin baking the gingerbread cookies that her children had come to expect as part of their holiday tradition. Eleanor was a woman of habit and order, a schoolteacher who had spent 23 years shaping young minds at Millbrook Central Elementary School. Her classroom was always immaculately organized, her lesson plans meticulous, and her home reflected the same philosophy. Everything had its place, everything served a purpose, and nothing was left to chance. The kitchen filled quickly with the warm aroma of spices. Eleanor moved with practiced efficiency, her gray-streaked auburn hair pulled back in a neat bun, her face showing the gentle lines of a woman in her early 50s, who had lived a life of quiet contentment. She wore her favorite green dress, the one she reserved for special occasions, and an apron embroidered with holly leaves that her youngest daughter, Catherine, had given her 3 Christmases ago. Robert Ashford would not wake for another 2 hours. He sat upstairs in the master bedroom, still sleeping soundly, undisturbed by the quiet sounds of his wife moving about the kitchen below. Robert was a contractor, a successful one, who had built much of the commercial infrastructure that defined Millbrook's modest downtown. He was a man of few words but quiet intelligence, known for his fair dealing and his commitment to quality work. At 56 years old, with silver threading through his dark hair, Robert had achieved the kind of stability and respect that most men aspire toward. But this morning, as Eleanor slid the first batch of cookies into the oven, neither she nor Robert could have known that the day unfolding before them would become the last day their family would spend together. They could not have known that the evening would bring a catastrophe so absolute, so bewildering, that it would haunt not just their extended family and community, but countless investigators and paranormal researchers for decades to come. At 7:15 in the morning, the sound of footsteps on the stairs signaled the awakening of the household. Thomas came down first, tall for his 14 years, with his father's dark hair and his mother's careful eyes. He was in that awkward age between boyhood and manhood, when a teenager is not quite sure which world they belong to. Thomas had always been the responsible one, the natural leader among his younger siblings. He had inherited his mother's conscientiousness and his father's pragmatism, a combination that had made him unusually mature for his age. "Smells incredible, Mom," Thomas said, pulling up a stool at the kitchen counter. Eleanor smiled at him, a gesture that would be caught in memory, frozen forever as one of the last warm interactions of the Ashford household. She ruffled his hair affectionately, a habit she maintained despite his protests that he was too old for such treatment. "The cookies will be ready in about 10 minutes, Eleanor said. "But don't you dare try to sneak one. These are for Christmas dinner guests. I've already hidden a batch in the back of the pantry for you children to nibble on later." By 8:00, the house was alive with activity. Margaret came padding down in her pajamas, her blonde hair tangled from sleep. She was 12 years old, at that tender age where childhood was beginning to feel embarrassingly restrictive, but adulthood still seemed impossibly distant. She moved toward her mother with that particular grace that girls her age sometimes possessed, already showing signs of the beautiful woman she would become, had she been allowed to become. James appeared next, dragging his younger brother David along by the hand. At 10 and 5 years old, respectively, they represented the younger branch of the Ashford children. James with his reddish-brown hair and gap-toothed grin, David with his serious expression and solemn eyes that seemed far too old for such a small face. David rarely smiled, and had always been a quiet, introspective child. His teachers at his kindergarten had noted his unusual maturity, his preference for solitary play, his tendency to observe rather than participate. The last to arrive was Catherine, who at 8 years old was perhaps the most fully Ashford of all the children. She had inherited her father's dark coloring and her mother's expressive features. She was also the most spirited of the 5, given to sudden enthusiasms and dramatic pronouncements. On this particular morning, she came down already dressed, despite the fact that it was barely past 8:00, wearing her red holiday dress, the one she had been saving since Thanksgiving. "We're going to have the most perfect Christmas," Catherine announced, climbing into her father's lap as Robert entered the kitchen, yawning and moving toward the coffee maker with the deliberate movements of a man not yet fully awake. "I can feel it. It's going to be absolutely magical." Robert pulled his daughter close, breathing in the strawberry scent of her shampoo. He had no way of knowing that these would be the last moments he would hold her, the last time he would hear her voice bright with anticipation, the last time he would feel her small frame press against his chest with the absolute certainty of a child who believes their parents can protect them from anything. "Well then," Robert said, his voice warm with affection, "we'd better make sure we live up to those expectations." The morning progressed in the comfortable rhythm of a family preparing for the holidays. Eleanor finished her baking while the children played in the living room, stringing popcorn and cranberries for the tree. The radio played Christmas carols, Perry Como and Bing Crosby, the classics that Eleanor preferred. Thomas helped his father move some boxes of decorations from the attic. Margaret and Catherine draped garland around the banister of the staircase, while James and David built a small fort out of cushions and blankets in the corner. By midday, Robert had gone into town to pick up some last-minute supplies and to handle some final business matters at his office. He would return by late afternoon, he promised, in plenty of time for the traditional Christmas Eve dinner that Eleanor had been planning for weeks. She had a prime rib already thawed in the refrigerator, vegetables prepared and waiting, and her famous Yorkshire pudding was going to be the centerpiece of the meal. Eleanor spent the afternoon supervising her children as they worked on the final preparations for the holiday. The house was already decorated. A Christmas tree stood in the corner of the living room, its branches heavy with ornaments collected over decades, many of them handmade by the children themselves over the years. Garland hung along the staircase and over the doorways. Holly and ivy had been arranged in vases throughout the house. A nativity scene occupied a place of honor on the mantelpiece. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the sky had finally delivered on its promise. Snow began to fall, just light at first, but soon building into a steady accumulation. The children pressed their faces against the windows, watching the white flakes drift down, watching the yard gradually transform into a winter wonderland. This was what Catherine had been praying for, the complete Christmas card image, the perfect backdrop for the holidays. "It's beautiful," Margaret whispered, her breath fogging the glass. Thomas reached over and squeezed his sister's shoulder. He was already beginning to understand, at 14 years old, that moments like these were fragile things, temporary windows into contentment that couldn't last forever. He had no way of knowing that he would not see another snowfall, that he would never experience another Christmas, that within a matter of hours, he and his siblings would simply cease to exist in any meaningful way. Robert returned home at 4:30, his truck laden with groceries and a few final gifts that he had insisted on purchasing, despite Eleanor's protests that they already had quite enough. He brought with him the scent of cold air and snow, and the children rushed to greet him as he came through the door, already anticipating the treats he usually carried when he returned from town. This time, he had stopped by the bakery and purchased fresh cinnamon rolls for breakfast the next morning, as well as a box of the expensive chocolates that Eleanor particularly favored. He handed them out with a paternal smile, bestowing them like small gifts, even though Christmas was tomorrow. "The roads are getting treacherous," Robert reported to his wife as he helped her prepare the final elements of dinner. "I heard on the radio that more snow is expected throughout the night. We might be snowed in by tomorrow morning. I've already filled the wood box by the fireplace and made sure the generator is in good working order, just in case." Eleanor smiled at her husband's natural pragmatism. Robert was always thinking ahead, always anticipating problems before they could develop. It was one of the reasons he had been so successful in his business. It was also one of the reasons she had married him, all those years ago, when they were both young, and the future seemed to stretch out before them like an endless road of possibilities. "Then we'll just have to make sure we make the most of being together," Eleanor said, squeezing his hand gently. "The children have been so excited. They've been absolutely perfect all week." At 6 o'clock in the evening, the Ashford family sat down to their Christmas Eve dinner. The table was set with Eleanor's best china, a damask tablecloth that had been in her family for 3 generations, and candles that cast a warm, flickering light across the faces of the 5 children and their parents. Outside the windows, the snow continued to fall, heavier now, accumulating on the sills and the roof. Thomas carved the prime rib under his father's direction, learning the skill that Robert had been gradually passing down to him. Margaret brought out the Yorkshire pudding, golden and perfect, and James carried the vegetables. Catherine and David took their seats, Catherine chattering constantly about her expectations for the next morning. David eating quietly, as was his habit, his serious eyes moving from person to person around the table. "I hope I get that bicycle," James said, his mouth half full of potatoes. Eleanor raised an eyebrow at him, a silent reminder about manners, and he swallowed before continuing. "The blue one with the racing stripes. Do you think—" "You'll find out tomorrow morning just like everyone else," Robert said, but his eyes were twinkling with the secret knowledge of a father who had indeed purchased exactly that bicycle. The conversation flowed around the table, memories of past Christmases, anticipation of presents, silly jokes and family laughter. It was, in every measurable way, the kind of dinner that people spend their whole lives trying to recreate, the kind of moment that families treasure and hold on to, looking back in later years with a bittersweet nostalgia for simpler times. Robert proposed a toast, raising his glass of wine while the children raised their glasses of cider. "To family," he said simply. "To being together. To the year ahead. To family," Eleanor echoed. And the children repeated the words. In that moment, none of them could have imagined that this would be the last meal they would share, the last time they would all be in the same room, the last time they would hear each other's voices speaking words of love and comfort and ordinary family affection. After dinner, they moved to the living room. A fire had been built in the fireplace, and it crackled cheerfully, casting dancing shadows across the room. Eleanor settled into her favorite chair with her knitting, a sweater for Thomas that she was determined to finish before the new year, while Robert sat nearby with the newspaper. The children scattered around the room in their various pursuits. Thomas had his nose in a book, one of the science fiction novels that had captured his imagination. Margaret played a record on the phonograph, Christmas music, instrumental versions of traditional carols. James and Catherine played a board game on the floor, their heads bent together in concentration, occasionally dissolving into giggles over some small joke between them. David sat near the fire, watching the flames with that same serious expression, occasionally reaching out to adjust the position of a log with the poker. At some point in the evening, Eleanor looked up from her knitting and took in the scene around her, the tree lights reflecting off the decorations, the warm glow of the fire, her husband's familiar silhouette in his chair, her 5 children, each absorbed in their own activities, but all present, all safe, all together. If she had known what was coming, if some whisper of future tragedy had touched her consciousness, she might have tried to hold on to that moment more tightly. She might have called the children closer, gathered them all in her arms, memorized every detail of their faces and voices. But she didn't know. Nobody knew. The future lay hidden, as it always does, wrapped in darkness and uncertainty. At 9 o'clock, Eleanor announced that it was time for the children to begin preparing for bed. There were the usual protests, particularly from Catherine, who swore she wasn't tired at all and would be awake when Santa arrived anyway. Eleanor remained firm, but gentle in her insistence, and the children gradually made their way upstairs. Thomas and James shared a bedroom on the 2nd floor. Margaret had her own room, decorated with posters of teenage idols and filled with the accumulated treasures of an adolescent girl. Catherine and David shared a smaller room at the end of the hall, separated from the master bedroom by a considerable distance. Robert stood at the top of the stairs, watching as Eleanor supervised the bedtime routine. She moved from room to room, ensuring that teeth were brushed, that pajamas were put on, that the children were tucked in with the rituals that had defined their childhoods. She bent to kiss each of them goodnight, her lips touching their foreheads in that gesture of maternal benediction that children never truly appreciate until they are old enough to understand what they might lose. "Tomorrow," Eleanor promised them, "we'll wake up early and see what's under the tree." "Do you think it really snowed all night?" Catherine asked from her bed, her small form barely visible under the heavy quilts. "I think it probably did," Eleanor said. "It's supposed to keep snowing until morning. Tomorrow is going to be a beautiful Christmas day." By 10 o'clock, the house had settled into that particular quiet that comes after children have been put to bed. Eleanor and Robert sat in the living room, finishing the last of the wine, listening to the wind outside pick up as the storm continued to build. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and Robert added another log, watching as the flames immediately began to consume the fresh wood. "You did a beautiful job," Robert said to his wife, reaching over to take her hand. "The children are lucky to have a mother who cares as much as you do." Eleanor smiled at him, squeezing his hand in return. "And they're lucky to have a father who provides for them so well. We're all lucky, aren't we, to have each other?" "We are," Robert agreed. Outside, the snow continued to fall, The wind began to howl around the corners of the house, finding small gaps in the windows, testing the integrity of the structure. The temperature continued to drop. By midnight, the accumulation on the ground was nearly 18 inches, and the forecast was calling for more. Chapter 2. The hours before. At 11:45 in the evening, Eleanor and Robert made their way upstairs to bed. The house was quiet, except for the sound of the wind outside and the occasional creak of the wooden structure settling. Robert locked the front door and checked the back door as well, habits of a practical man who took security seriously. They moved quietly through the upstairs hallway, neither of them wanting to disturb the children. Outside Catherine and David's room, Eleanor paused, listening for the sound of their breathing. She could hear David's steady respiration and Catherine's occasional sleep mumble. In the boys' room across the hall, both Thomas and James were sleeping soundly. Margaret's room was silent, and Eleanor assumed her eldest daughter was lost in whatever dreams occupied the mind of a 12-year-old girl on Christmas Eve. In the master bedroom, Robert prepared the fire that would warm them through the night. The bedroom was large and well-appointed, with windows that faced toward the front of the property. From bed, they could see out toward Blackwood Lane, where the snow was beginning to pile up against the fence posts and the road beyond. Eleanor sat at her vanity, removing the pins from her hair and brushing it out. At 51 years old, she still possessed a kind of quiet beauty, the beauty of a woman who had lived well and without regret. Robert watched her from the bed, feeling a familiar wave of affection. They had been married for 27 years, and there were still moments when he looked at her and saw the young woman he had fallen in love with, the woman who had agreed to marry him and build this life with him. "Thank you," he said softly. Eleanor turned from her vanity, curious. For what? For everything. For the children. For this house. For the life we've built. For choosing to spend your life with me. Eleanor rose from her seat and came to the bed, sliding under the covers beside her husband. She curved herself against him in the familiar way of two people who have spent decades sleeping in the same bed, and he wrapped his arms around her. "I wouldn't choose any other life," she said, and they drifted off to sleep to the sound of the wind outside and the warmth of the fire in the fireplace. In the boys' room, Thomas lay awake in his bed, listening to his brother's snores from the other side of the room. He had not been able to sleep, his mind too active with thoughts of tomorrow morning, with anticipation and excitement. Thomas was at an age where Christmas had begun to feel slightly childish to him, but he still harbored a kind of secret enthusiasm for the holiday, one that he tried to hide from his friends at school, but which he embraced fully within the privacy of his home. He thought about the things he had asked for this year: a new bicycle, a telescope for the backyard, some books. He thought about the fact that next year he would be 15, that he was halfway through his teenage years already. He thought about the future and what it might hold for him. He was thinking vaguely about maybe studying engineering, like some of his father's business associates. The future stretched ahead of him, full of infinite possibility. At some point, tiredness began to overcome him, and his thoughts became less coherent. His eyes grew heavy, and he drifted off into the deep sleep of the young, untroubled by any premonition of what was to come. In her room, Margaret lay awake as well, though her reasons were different from her brother's. Margaret had been struggling, in that way that adolescent girls sometimes do, with the social complexities of middle school. There was a boy in her class, David Warner, with his sandy hair and his quarterback status in the 8th grade football program, and Margaret had convinced herself that he was the love of her life. She spent considerable time thinking about him, wondering if he would ever notice her, crafting elaborate fantasies in which they somehow ended up together. She had written about him in her diary, passages that ranged from hopeful to despondent, depending on what had happened that particular day at school. This was the kind of emotional turbulence that only adolescence could produce, and Eleanor had watched her daughter navigate it with sympathetic understanding. She had assured Margaret that these feelings would pass, that David Warner would eventually fade from her consciousness. That time would reveal to her how many other options the future held. Margaret did not believe her mother, of course. She was convinced that her current suffering was unique and unprecedented, that no one had ever felt the way she felt about another person. She lay in her bed on this Christmas Eve night, thinking about David Warner, wondering if he was awake on his own Christmas Eve, if he was thinking about anything important, if he would ever know that a girl in his math class thought about him constantly. Eventually, she too gave in to sleep, and her features smoothed out into the peaceful repose of adolescent slumber. Catherine, in the room she shared with David, chattered quietly for a while after Eleanor had left, her small voice forming words that nobody was there to hear. She talked to the stuffed animals arranged on the shelf above her bed, narrating an elaborate scenario in which they all went on an adventure to the North Pole to meet Santa Claus. She talked about what she hoped to find under the tree in the morning. She talked about her friend Susan at school, and about the boy in the 4th grade who had pulled her hair and then given her an apple, which she had decided meant he liked her very much. At some point, her monologue faded into drowsy mumbling, and then silence. David watched his sister from his bed, his serious eyes tracking her movements, even as she slept. David did not speak much. Both his parents and his teachers had noted this peculiarity about him. He seemed perfectly capable of speech, but he chose to remain silent more often than not. He had a richness of inner life that he kept locked away from the rest of the world, a kind of solitary consciousness that made him seem older than his 5 years. He lay awake longer than his sister, listening to the wind outside, listening to the small sounds of the house settling around him. He had a dog-eared copy of a picture book on his nightstand, one about a little boy who went on an adventure to a magical kingdom. He had read it so many times that he had nearly memorized it, though he could not yet read all of the words. He understood the pictures, though, and he understood the emotional arc of the story. The boy left home, had an adventure, and came back to his family, where he was safe and loved. David pulled the book to his chest, holding it the way another child might hold a teddy bear, and drifted into sleep. By 1 o'clock in the morning, the entire Ashford household was asleep. The fire in the master bedroom had burned down to glowing embers. The fire in the living room fireplace had been carefully banked by Robert before he went to bed, a pile of ashes heaped over the coals to preserve the warmth through the night. All around the house, the wind howled, and the snow continued to fall. Chapter 3. The night, the world changed. The exact time that the fire started has never been definitively established. The state fire marshal's investigation, conducted in the days following the incident, determined that the fire had likely begun somewhere between 1:30 and 2 o'clock in the morning on Christmas morning, 1987. But even this estimation was complicated by the unusual nature of the fire itself, the way it burned, the patterns it created, the evidence it left behind. The fire began in the master bedroom. This much was established with reasonable certainty. The burn patterns on the walls, the way the ceiling had collapsed, the distribution of debris, all of these factors pointed toward the master bedroom as the point of origin. But how it started, and why it spread in the way that it did, would remain a source of intense speculation and debate. At approximately 1:45 in the morning, the fire was still small, perhaps contained to the immediate area around the fireplace, or possibly originating from the fireplace itself. Perhaps a log had rolled out of the grate. Perhaps there had been a defect in the fireplace construction. Perhaps, though this was considered less likely, Robert had neglected to properly bank the fire before going to bed. But something happened in those early moments that caused the fire to behave in an unusual way. Rather than spreading gradually through the bedroom, consuming furniture and textiles in the usual manner of a residential fire, it seemed to accelerate rapidly, moving with an almost purposeful intensity from the master bedroom toward the hallway beyond. Within perhaps 15 minutes, the fire had consumed not only the master bedroom, but had begun making its way up the staircase toward the 2nd floor, where the children's rooms were located. At some point in those early minutes, likely around 2 o'clock in the morning, the heat and smoke became sufficient to trigger some instinctive alarm in Robert Ashford's sleeping consciousness. He woke, perhaps confused at first, perhaps sensing danger before he was fully aware of what was happening. According to the investigation later conducted by State Fire Marshal Edmund Whitley and his team, Robert Ashford likely realized within moments that the fire had grown beyond the point where it could be contained by personal action. The evidence suggests that he woke Eleanor, that they both rose from their bed, and that Robert attempted to reach the hallway to reach the children's rooms. But the fire had already spread to the staircase. The hallway was filling with smoke. The heat was building exponentially, fed by the wood structure of the house itself, by the furniture and curtains and carpet that made up the fabric of a family home. Robert would have made the decision, in those few crucial seconds, that it was too late to reach the children by the normal route. The staircase was impassable. The only other way to reach them would be through the windows, going outside, around the house, trying to reach the children through their bedroom windows from the outside. But even as he was making this decision, the fire was building. Even as he and Eleanor were trying to coordinate a response to the catastrophe unfolding around them, The flames were advancing, consuming the structure, filling the air with smoke and heat and the toxic gases produced by burning wood and plastic and all of the accumulated materials of a 20th century home. This is where the evidence becomes confused, where the investigation becomes uncertain, where the story of that night begins to diverge into different versions depending on who was telling it. According to the official investigation, Robert Ashford did not survive long enough to reach the children. Eleanor Ashford, attempting to follow him, was overcome by smoke inhalation. The remains of both were found in the hallway outside their bedroom, a distance of perhaps 15 feet from the door. But how the children disappeared, this is where the case takes its turn into genuine mystery. The evidence suggested that the fire, at some point, had reached a level of intensity that should have been lethal to anyone in the house. Temperatures in the master bedroom and hallway exceeded 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to cause wooden beams to burst into flames spontaneously, hot enough to turn metal fixtures into molten pools, hot enough that survival should have been impossible for anyone trapped in those areas. Yet the investigation revealed something extraordinary. The children's rooms showed evidence of heat exposure, but not to the same degree as the master bedroom and hallway. The heat damage in the children's rooms was irregular, with some areas showing intense burn patterns, while others showed surprisingly little damage. Furniture in Margaret's room was partially burned but not completely consumed. The beds in the boys' room showed evidence of extreme heat, but the headboards and footboards remained partially intact. This is where the investigation first noted something unusual. The windows in the children's rooms were closed. Not locked, but closed. The doors were also closed. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence that the children had attempted to escape. The doorknobs were cool to the touch compared to what they should have been, given the intensity of the fire. The windows were not broken. It was as if the children had remained in their beds, undisturbed, even as the fire raged through the rest of the house. The fire department had arrived at the scene at approximately 2:35 in the morning. A neighbor, awakened by the sound of the fire and the glow visible through the trees that separated his property from the Ashford house, had called 911 at approximately 2:20. By the time the firefighters arrived, the house was fully engulfed. The fire consumed the structure with an intensity that shocked even the experienced firefighters. It took nearly 4 hours to bring it under full control. By the time they were able to safely enter the building and begin searching for survivors, there was very little left of the house itself. They found Robert and Eleanor in the hallway. The identification was made primarily through dental records and other forensic evidence, as the bodies had been severely burned. But they were found, which provided a tragic but definite answer to the question of what had happened to the parents. But the children were nowhere to be found. The initial assumption was that their bodies had been completely consumed by the fire. This was not an unusual occurrence in residential fires of extreme intensity. Human bodies, when exposed to temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Fahrenheit for extended periods, can be reduced to almost nothing. Fragmented bone, ash, incomplete remains that might be mistaken for debris, or accidentally mixed with the destruction of the building itself. But as the fire marshal's team began their systematic investigation of the rubble, this explanation began to seem increasingly unlikely. Bones from the parents were found. Even in their severely burned state, the skeletal remains were identifiable as adult remains. But despite an extensive and careful search through the entire site, no bones, not a single fragment, belonging to any of the 5 children were discovered. This finding was so unusual that the investigation was expanded. The area around the house was searched. The debris was carefully sifted. Expert forensic anthropologists were brought in to examine the remains more carefully, to see if perhaps some fragments had been overlooked or misidentified. But nothing was found. The absence of the children's remains became the defining mystery of the case. By the time the investigation was formally concluded, 3 different possibilities had been considered and discussed. First, the possibility that the children had somehow escaped the fire and left the property. This seemed unlikely, given that the house was surrounded by several acres of heavily wooded land, and no neighboring properties were close enough for a child to have reached on foot in the time available. Furthermore, no evidence of the children appearing at any location in the following days or weeks was ever discovered. No child matching any of the 5 Ashford children was found in any hospital, police station, or shelter within a 100-mile radius. Second, the possibility that the children's remains had been so completely consumed by the fire that they left no identifiable traces. This was theoretically possible, though fire marshals estimated that such complete consumption would be extremely unusual even in a fire of this intensity. Typically, some fragments of bone would remain, even if they were small and partially fragmented. Third, and the one that was rarely spoken aloud, but that hung over the investigation like a dark cloud, was the possibility that the children were not in the house when the fire started. But this seemed impossible. Multiple neighbors had reported seeing the children enter the house with their parents the previous evening. No one had reported seeing any of the children leave the house after dark. The doors were closed, the windows were closed, and the fire had started in the master bedroom, far from any of the exits. Where could they have gone? Chapter 4. The investigation begins. Sheriff Edmund Walsh was 62 years old, just 2 years away from his planned retirement. He was a methodical man, not particularly given to flights of fancy or wild theorizing, and he had established a reputation in the town of Millbrook as a fair-minded lawman who took his responsibilities seriously. When the fire marshal's report indicated that the remains of 5 children could not be located, Edmund's first instinct was not to investigate the paranormal, but to consider the practical possibilities. Perhaps the children were alive. Perhaps, in some twist of circumstance, they had escaped the fire and were wandering in the snow-covered woods, lost and frightened. This seemed like the most likely scenario to Edmund, and he immediately organized a search party. By Christmas morning, the snow had stopped falling, and a clear, cold day had dawned over the Connecticut landscape. The temperature had dropped to near zero, and the wind had died down to a light breeze. The forest that surrounded the Ashford property was transformed into a winter wonderland of white-covered trees and crystalline beauty. It was also, Edmund knew, a place where children exposed to this cold could not survive for long. The search party consisted of volunteers from the town, local men who knew the area and who had quickly gathered at the fire scene with their own ideas of how they could help. They were organized into search teams, each assigned a particular direction to search radiating outward from the house. They called out the names of the children as they walked through the woods, their voices carrying through the frozen air. Thomas, Margaret, James, Catherine, David! But the woods remained silent except for the crunch of snow beneath their feet and the occasional call of a winter bird. By the end of Christmas Day, after searching for nearly 12 hours, the volunteers had covered perhaps a 10-mile radius around the house. They had found nothing, no sign of the children. No indication that anyone had moved through the woods in the hours following the fire. No shelters that might have been used for protection from the cold. Edmund sat in his office that evening, a cup of cold coffee growing cold on his desk, and tried to make sense of what he was facing. 5 children had vanished. Their parents were dead. The house had burned to the ground, and there seemed to be no rational explanation for any of it. He picked up the phone and dialed the number for State Fire Marshal Edmund Whitley, a different Edmund, though Edmund Walsh sometimes found it amusing to talk with someone who shared his first name. "The children," Edmund said without preamble. "Have you found any of their remains?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Whitley's voice came back, carefully neutral. "Not a trace," Whitley said. "I've had my team go through every inch of that rubble. I've brought in additional experts. We've sifted the debris. We've examined every bone fragment we could find. The parents, or at least the remains we've identified as the parents, are definitely there. But the children, nothing." "You're certain?" Edmund asked. "I'm certain," Whitley said. "Believe me, I wish I wasn't, but I am." Edmund hung up the phone and sat back in his chair. He was a man of logic and evidence, and the evidence he was looking at made no sense. Either the children had escaped the fire, in which case, where were they? Or they had perished in it, in which case, where were their remains? The days that followed the Christmas Eve fire saw an explosion of activity in and around Millbrook. The state police became involved. The FBI was contacted, and, after some deliberation, agreed to send a team to investigate. News crews descended on the small town, setting up cameras and conducting interviews with anyone who had known the Ashford family. Eleanor Ashford's principal at the elementary school gave interviews describing her as a dedicated teacher and a devoted mother. Robert Ashford's business associates talked about his reputation for integrity and fair dealing. Neighbors described the family as quiet and unassuming, exactly the kind of people you would not expect to be at the center of such a tragedy. But the story that the news networks were most interested in was not the tragic death of the parents. It was the mystery of the 5 children. 5 children missing. After Christmas Eve fire, the headlines read, "The case of the vanishing Ashford children." News anchors discussed the case on evening broadcasts. Radio stations ran updates. Within a week, the Ashford family had become a national story, discussed in living rooms across the country, theorized about in bars and coffee shops. And still, there were no answers. Edmund Walsh found himself at the center of a media circus that he had never experienced in his long career. Reporters called his office constantly, asking him to comment on various theories. They wanted to know if he thought the children had been abducted. They wanted to know if he thought they were still alive. They wanted to know if he believed in the possibility of supernatural involvement, a suggestion that Edmund dismissed curtly whenever it came up. "We're dealing with facts," he told the reporters, "not speculation." But as the days became weeks, and the weeks became months, the lack of facts became increasingly frustrating. There were no leads. There were no witnesses who had seen the children after the fire started. There was no evidence of where they might have gone, or what might have happened to them. The Christmas season of 1987 came and went. The new year arrived. Winter gradually gave way to spring, and the snow melted, revealing the blackened foundation of the Ashford house like a scar on the landscape. By February, the official investigation had ground to a halt. The fire had been ruled accidental, probably originating in the fireplace, though this could not be stated with absolute certainty. The deaths of Robert and Eleanor Ashford had been ruled accidental, caused by smoke inhalation and fire exposure. But the children, the investigation into their fate had officially stalled. This did not stop Edmund Walsh from investigating. In the months following the fire, Edmund spent considerable time going back through the details, reviewing statements, considering possibilities. He interviewed every neighbor who lived within a mile of the property. He reviewed the fire marshal's investigation in exhaustive detail. He examined photographs of the scene, looking for something, anything, that might explain what had happened. It was during one of these late-night sessions in his office, reading through fire marshal reports, that he noticed something that struck him as odd. In the fire marshal's detailed documentation of the burn patterns in the children's rooms, there was a notation about unusual scorch marks on the walls of Catherine and David's room. These marks formed a pattern, according to the fire marshal's notes, that was consistent with the passage of something moving rapidly through the room, though the exact nature and origin of this passage could not be determined. Edmund made a note and scheduled a follow-up conversation with Whitley. "These marks in Catherine and David's room," Edmund said, spreading the fire marshal's photographs across his desk. "What do you make of them?" Whitley leaned over the photographs, studying them carefully. He was a man in his late 50s, with the weathered face of someone who had spent much of his career dealing with the aftermath of disaster. "I've been puzzling over those myself," Whitley admitted. "The pattern is unusual. You see how the burn intensity is higher here and here, but there's a kind of channel or path where the intensity is lower. It's as if something moved through the room, and the heat followed that path. Could it have been caused by the collapse of the structure?" Edmund asked. "Part of the floor above falling through?" "I considered that," Whitley said, "but the pattern doesn't support it. If debris had fallen, you'd expect a more scattered, chaotic burn pattern. This is too organized, too deliberate." Edmund studied the photograph more carefully, running his finger along the pattern of burns. It did seem to follow a specific path, starting near the door and running across the room toward the window. "Could something have been dragged across the floor?" Edmund asked. "Possibly," Whitley said, "but we found no evidence of what it might have been. And besides, if something had been dragged, furniture or anything else, we would expect to find remnants of it, some kind of debris, but there's nothing." Edmund set the photograph down, feeling frustrated. "So you have no explanation?" "No," Whitley said simply. "I don't." Edmund continued his investigation into the spring of 1988, but gradually, other cases demanded his attention. A murder case took his focus for several months. A string of robberies in the neighboring town of Riverside required his attention. The Ashford case, which had dominated his thoughts for the first few months after the fire, became just one of many files sitting on his desk, a mystery that remained unsolved, but no longer actively pursued. By the end of 1988, nearly a year after the fire, the case had essentially gone cold. The missing children were placed on a national missing persons registry, their photographs posted in public places, their names mentioned occasionally in periodic retrospective news stories about the case. But no leads came in. No evidence emerged that would explain what had happened. The lot where the Ashford house had stood remained vacant for several years. Eventually it was purchased by a developer who built a new subdivision on the property. The foundation of the old house was buried under asphalt and new construction, The physical evidence of the tragedy literally covered over by the march of progress. But for Edmund Walsh, the case never truly closed. He kept the files in his office, and occasionally, when he was working late, or when some small detail caught his attention, he would pull them out and review them again, hoping that some insight might strike him, some connection that he had previously missed. It never did. Chapter 5. The Alternative Theories. As the official investigation into the fate of the Ashford children stalled and eventually ceased, a vacuum opened up. Into this vacuum stepped amateur investigators, paranormal researchers, conspiracy theorists, and true crime enthusiasts who, in the years following the tragedy, began to develop their own theories about what had happened on Christmas Eve, 1987. One of the first serious alternative investigations was undertaken by a man named Dr. Marcus Whitley, no relation to the fire marshal, who was a paranormal researcher based in Boston. Dr. Whitley had developed a reputation for approaching unexplained phenomena with a combination of scientific methodology and openness to non-conventional explanations. When he read about the Ashford case in the summer of 1988, he became intrigued. Dr. Whitley traveled to Millbrook and conducted his own interviews with witnesses, neighbors, and officials involved in the case. He studied the fire marshal's reports and the photographs of the scene. He consulted with experts in various fields: arson investigators, child psychologists, forensic anthropologists, and developed what he believed to be a coherent theory about what had happened. In a paper published in 1989 in a Journal of Paranormal Research, Dr. Whitley proposed that the Ashford children might have been victims of what he called a mass vanishing event, a phenomenon that he suggested occurred more frequently than was generally acknowledged, in which multiple people would disappear from a location in circumstances that suggested simultaneous, inexplicable departures. Dr. Whitley's theory, while provocative, was not widely accepted by mainstream investigators, but it did generate considerable interest among paranormal enthusiasts, and it led to a network of amateur researchers who began to focus on the Ashford case as a potential example of a broader phenomenon. Another theory that gained traction, particularly in certain online communities in the late 1990s and early 2000s, was the suggestion that the children had been abducted by some kind of external force, either extraterrestrial or interdimensional in nature. Proponents of this theory pointed to the lack of remains, the unusual burn patterns, and the sealed windows and doors as evidence that conventional explanations were inadequate. These theories were largely rejected by serious investigators, but they reflected the desperation that people felt in the face of a genuine mystery. The fact that 5 children could simply vanish without leaving a trace, despite extensive searching and official investigation, seemed to demand an explanation that went beyond the mundane and rational. A third theory, one that gained some credence among certain criminologists and investigators, was that the children had not vanished in the fire, but rather had disappeared in the hours or days before it, that the fire had been set deliberately to cover up their absence. This theory suggested several possible scenarios. Perhaps the children had been abducted by someone who had them and had set the fire to eliminate the evidence and cover up their crime. Perhaps Robert Ashford, troubled by some personal issue or financial crisis, had arranged for the children to be taken and had started the fire himself to distract investigators. Perhaps Eleanor had suffered a mental break and had done something to harm the children, afterward setting the fire in a kind of murder-suicide attempt that had gone wrong. But none of these theories could be reconciled with the evidence. Robert Ashford's financial situation was stable. There were no indications of personal crisis. Eleanor had no history of mental illness. And most importantly, multiple witnesses had seen all 5 children entering the house with their parents on Christmas Eve afternoon. There were no reports of strangers in the area. There was no evidence of struggle or foul play in the hours before the fire. In 1992, 5 years after the fire, a woman named Lisa Cardwell published a book titled The Ashford Enigma, A Study of Mystery and Loss. In the book, Cardwell interviewed everyone who had been connected to the case: neighbors, investigators, relatives of the Ashford family, paranormal researchers. She documented the various theories that had been proposed, analyzed the evidence in detail, and ultimately concluded that the truth of what had happened to the 5 children would probably never be known. The Ashford case, Cardwell wrote, represents a kind of absolute mystery, a situation in which all the conventional tools of investigation have been exhausted, and yet no satisfactory explanation has emerged. we are left with only questions. Where did the children go? How did they vanish without leaving a trace? What happened in that house on the night of December 24th, 1987? These questions would remain unanswered for the next 2 decades. Chapter 6. The Ash and the Ember. In the years following the Ashford fire, the town of Millbrook gradually moved on. People who had known the family occasionally mentioned the tragedy, but as time passed and a new generation grew up without knowledge of the event, it faded into local history. A dark chapter in the town's past, but a chapter that had been turned. Eleanor's teaching position at Millbrook Central Elementary School was filled by another teacher. Robert's contracting business was purchased by one of his business associates and eventually sold to a larger firm from Hartford. The relatives of the Ashford family gradually dispersed. Eleanor had a sister who lived in Massachusetts, and she inherited whatever possessions had not been destroyed in the fire. Robert's brother had moved to Florida and showed little interest in maintaining a presence in the town where the tragedy had occurred. But the mystery of the 5 children's disappearance did not fade completely. It took on a kind of cultural persistence, particularly after the emergence of the internet in the 1990s, which provided a platform for amateur researchers and true crime enthusiasts to discuss the case. In 1996, a website was created dedicated to documenting and discussing the Ashford case. The website, titled The 5 Children, A Remembrance and Investigation, became a gathering place for people who were interested in the mystery. Investigators would post theories and analyses. The site maintained detailed information about each of the 5 children: photographs, biographical information, accounts of their personalities and interests. Thomas Ashford was remembered as a responsible and thoughtful young man, talented in school, and well-liked by his teachers. Margaret was described as intelligent and artistic, with a particular passion for music and literature. James was remembered as a spirited and creative child, full of laughter and mischief. Catherine was recalled as energetic and optimistic, a girl who had seemed to carry sunlight with her wherever she went. And David, the youngest, was described as a serious and introspective child, quiet but observant, with a depth of personality that belied his 5 years. Reading the accumulation of these memories and testimonies, one began to understand not just the mystery of their disappearance, but the impact that the loss of these children had on those who had known them. Eleanor's sister, Margaret Ashford Wallace, wrote a contribution to the website years after the fire. In it, she reflected on her sister's dedication to her children, and her devastation that Eleanor had not lived to see them grow into adults. Eleanor, Margaret wrote, was the kind of mother who thought about her children's needs before her own, who found meaning and purpose in the work of raising them. When she died that night, she died not knowing what had happened to them. She died in confusion and terror, and the agony of not being able to reach them. This, to me, is the most tragic aspect of the Ashford case. Not just the mystery of what happened to the children, but the knowledge that their parents died in an attempt to reach them, and that this attempt was ultimately futile. In the early 2000s, a documentary filmmaker named Richard Kessler became interested in the Ashford case. Over the course of 2 years, he conducted extensive research, traveled to Millbrook multiple times, interviewed survivors and investigators, and gathered hundreds of hours of archival footage and photographs. The resulting documentary, broadcast on the Unsolved Mysteries television series in 2003, brought renewed attention to the case. The episode received strong ratings, and letters poured in from viewers who had theories about what had happened, who claimed to have seen evidence online, who believed they knew the truth about the vanished children. But the documentary, despite its comprehensive approach and its careful presentation of the evidence, did nothing to solve the mystery. If anything, it deepened it. Among the revelations contained in the documentary was an interview with a woman named Eleanor Walsh, Edmund Walsh's widow. Eleanor had given an interview in which she described her late husband's personal conviction that the case was not closed, that there was something about the evidence that did not fit conventional explanations. Edmund always said, Eleanor Walsh reflected, that the case violated the laws of nature in a way, that you cannot have 5 children simply cease to exist without leaving any evidence of their fate. He said it was like the children had been erased, as if they had never existed at all, and that the only explanations for such a thing were either that they had survived and escaped, which would have left some trace, some evidence, or that something inexplicable had happened, something that he could not explain, and that he did not fully understand. Edmund Walsh had died in 2001, at the age of 76, having never solved the mystery that had occupied so much of his attention in the years following the fire. The documentary did find one piece of information that had not been previously publicized, a statement from the neighbor who had called 911 when the fire was discovered. This neighbor, Gerald McPherson, described hearing an unusual sound in the hours before he became aware that the Ashford house was on fire. It was around 2 o'clock in the morning, McPherson stated in an interview for the documentary. I was still awake. I suffer from insomnia, and I often lie in bed listening to the wind. But on this night, I heard something else. I heard something I can only describe it as a sound like rushing wind, but more intense than anything I had ever heard before. It lasted for perhaps 30 seconds, maybe less, and then it stopped. I got up and looked out the window, but I couldn't see anything in the dark. I didn't think much of it at the time, but later, when I learned that the fire had started around that same time, I wondered if the sound I had heard had been related. McPherson's testimony, while intriguing, could not be definitively connected to the fire. It might have been the sound of the wind howling around the corners of the structure. It might have been some other phenomenon entirely, but it did reinforce the sense that something unusual had happened on that night, something that went beyond the ordinary parameters of a residential fire. By the time the documentary aired, Edmund Walsh had been deceased for 2 years, and Sheriff Wendell Thompson, who had taken over Edmund's position, had no new information to add to the investigation. The case, as far as official investigators were concerned, remained unsolved and was unlikely to ever be solved. Chapter 7. The Anniversaries. As the years passed, the Ashford case took on the character of a legend, a story that was told and retold, that accumulated interpretations and modifications, that became almost mythological in nature. In 1997, 10 years after the fire, the Millbrook Historical Society organized a commemoration of the tragedy. A small gathering was held in the town square, and a plaque was placed on a stone monument that read, "In memory of Robert and Eleanor Ashford and their 5 children, Thomas, Margaret, James, Catherine, and David, who perished in a fire on Christmas Eve, 1987. May they rest in peace." The wording of the plaque, which stated that all 7 family members had perished, was a kind of official closing of the case. It represented a consensus that, regardless of how the children had died, they were indeed dead. But for those who were interested in the mystery, the plaque seemed like an evasion of the truth rather than a statement of it. The case gained renewed attention in the early 2000s, following the documentary broadcast. A novel based loosely on the events was published by an author named Richard Matheson, titled The Fire on Blackwood Lane. While the novel took considerable creative liberty with the events, it brought the story to a new audience and reinvigorated interest in the case among younger readers. Online forums and discussion boards dedicated to true crime began to feature lengthy threads discussing the Ashford case. People compiled databases of information. Some amateur researchers attempted to contact surviving relatives, asking for permission to investigate further. A few published their own theories and analyses online. One particularly detailed theory, posted in 2005 by a researcher named Stephen Hartley on a true crime website, suggested that the children had been taken by someone connected to the family, perhaps a distant relative or a former employee who harbored some grudge. Hartley proposed that this person had set the fire to cover up the abduction, and that the children had survived, but had been hidden or relocated to a distant location. Hartley's theory was based partly on speculation and partly on a reanalysis of the fire marshal's report. He suggested that the unusual burn patterns in the children's rooms could be consistent with the removal of the children from those rooms through some means. Perhaps they had been carried down the exterior of the house via a ladder or some other device before the fire reached their room. But Hartley's theory, like all the others that had been proposed over the years, remained speculative and unsupported by hard evidence. In 2007, 20 years after the fire, the local news station in Hartford produced a retrospective documentary titled 20 Years Later, The Mystery of the Ashford Children. The documentary featured interviews with investigators who were still living, and it presented what was known at the 20th anniversary of the tragedy. What was striking about the documentary was how little new information had emerged in the 20 years since the fire. The investigation had essentially stalled in 1988, and despite continued amateur research and renewed media attention, no definitive answers had been found. By 2012, 25 years after the fire, the Ashford case had faded substantially from public consciousness. It was still discussed on true crime websites and in paranormal forums, but it was no longer the subject of major media investigations or documentary projects. The case had become a kind of historical artifact, discussed by those who were interested in unsolved mysteries but largely forgotten by the general public. Yet among those who studied such cases, paranormal researchers, forensic experts, criminologists, the Ashford fire retained a kind of haunting significance. It represented a genuine mystery, a situation in which the disappearance of 5 children could not be adequately explained by conventional investigation. Chapter 8. The Final Whispers. In the decades that followed the Ashford fire, various claims and accounts emerged from people who said they had information about what had happened to the children. Some of these claims were obviously fraudulent or delusional. Others seemed more credible, even if they could not be definitively verified. In 1993, a woman named Dorothy Chen came forward with a story that she had been running from something her entire life. She said she had no memory of her childhood before the age of 7, that she had been found alone in Boston in 1988 by social workers with no identification and no recollection of who she was or where she came from. Dorothy's age would have made her approximately 1 year old in 1987, which did not match any of the Ashford children. But the story did generate some media interest, and various amateur researchers became interested in the possibility that some of the Ashford children might have survived and been discovered with no memory of their previous lives. However, Dorothy's DNA was eventually tested and did not match any of the missing Ashford children, and her case faded from attention. In 1996, a man claiming to be Thomas Ashford came forward and claimed that he had survived the fire and had been living under an assumed identity for nearly a decade. He provided some details that seemed to match the biographical information of Thomas. He spoke about his younger siblings by name. He recalled details about the Ashford house, but this claim was also eventually discredited. The man was determined to be mentally ill and suffering from delusions. He had no corroborating evidence to support his claim, and he eventually recanted his story, admitting that he had become fascinated by the case and had convinced himself that he was one of the missing children. In 2002, a researcher named Jennifer Blackwood, who had been investigating the Ashford case for several years, published a detailed analysis in which she proposed that the children had not been abducted or killed by the fire, but rather that they had been placed in some kind of protective custody or witness protection situation by federal authorities, and that the fire had been a cover story for their disappearance. Blackwood's theory was based on speculation that the Ashford parents might have been involved in some kind of criminal activity or witness situation that had necessitated the removal of their children. However, her investigation found no evidence to support this theory. Robert Ashford's business dealings appeared to be entirely legitimate, and there was no indication that either Robert or Eleanor had any connection to federal law enforcement or organized crime. By 2010, the Ashford case had been thoroughly examined and re-examined from virtually every conceivable angle. Hundreds of theories had been proposed and analyzed. Thousands of pages of documents had been compiled and studied. And yet the fundamental mystery remained. What had happened to the 5 Ashford children on the night of December 24, 1987? Chapter 9. The Last Known Information. As of the time of this writing, in the year 2025, 38 years after the fire, the Ashford case remains officially unsolved. No new evidence has emerged in recent years. No breakthrough investigations have been announced. The case has essentially been archived, remaining a note in the historical records of Connecticut law enforcement, but no longer the subject of active investigation. A memorial to the Ashford family has been established in Millbrook. On each Christmas Eve, some local residents gather at the memorial to remember those who died in the fire. The names of the 7 family members, Robert, Eleanor, Thomas, Margaret, James, Catherine, and David, are read aloud, and flowers are placed at the base of the memorial stone. But the mystery of how 5 children could vanish without a trace remains unsolved. In the decades of investigation that have followed the fire, certain facts have been established with reasonable certainty. First, the fire did occur on the night of December 24th and the morning of December 25th, 1987. The cause of the fire was most likely related to the fireplace in the master bedroom, though absolute certainty on this point could never be achieved. Second, Robert and Eleanor Ashford did perish in the fire. Their remains were positively identified through dental records and other forensic evidence. Third, the 5 children, Thomas, Margaret, James, Catherine, and David, did not leave any remains that could be recovered from the fire site. Despite extensive and careful searching of the rubble and the surrounding area, no bone fragments, no teeth, no DNA evidence connecting any of the 5 children to the fire site was ever found. Fourth, there is no evidence that the children survived the fire and escaped to another location. No child matching any of the 5 Ashford children was discovered in any location in the days, weeks, or months following the fire. No ransom demands were ever made. No kidnappings were reported. Fifth, the circumstances of the fire created a situation in which conventional escape seems to have been impossible. The fire spread rapidly from the master bedroom to the staircase, cutting off the primary means of egress from the second floor. The windows in the children's rooms were closed and not broken. The doors to their rooms were closed. Beyond these facts, everything remains in the realm of speculation and theory. Some researchers have suggested that the most likely explanation is that the children did perish in the fire, but that the intensity of the heat was sufficient to reduce their remains to ash and fragmented bone that became mixed with the general debris of the destroyed house and was not recovered during the investigation. This explanation is possible, but it does not fully account for the complete absence of any identifiable remains. Even in the most intense fires, some fragments of bone typically survive. The complete absence of such fragments is unusual. Other researchers have suggested that some kind of external force, whether supernatural, psychological, or physical, caused the children to disappear from the house in the minutes before or during the fire. This explanation accounts for the absence of remains, but it introduces an element that defies rational explanation. Still others have suggested that the official investigation was incomplete or flawed, that crucial evidence was overlooked, that some possibility was not adequately explored. But all of these theories remain matters of speculation. The truth of what happened to the 5 Ashford children on Christmas Eve, 1987, remains unknown. Chapter 10. The Lingering Questions. As we approach the 4th decade since the tragedy, certain questions continue to haunt those who have studied the case. If the children escaped the fire, where are they? How could 5 children, ranging in age from 5 to 14, survive in a snow-covered forest in sub-zero temperatures without leaving any trace? How could they reach safety without being reported by anyone? How could they have avoided detection for more than 35 years? If the children perished in the fire, where are their remains? In the most extreme fires, some evidence of bone survives. Even cremation at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit typically leaves identifiable fragments. The complete absence of any such fragments is scientifically anomalous. What was the unusual sound that Gerald McPherson heard at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning? Could it have been related to the fire? If so, what could produce such a sound? What do the unusual burn patterns in Catherine and David's room signify? Why does the burn pattern suggest the passage of something moving rapidly through the room? Why were the doors and windows of the children's rooms closed, despite the intensity of the fire in the rest of the house? Why is there no evidence that the children attempted to escape? If there was some kind of supernatural involvement in the disappearance, what form did it take? What mechanism could cause 5 children to vanish without leaving any physical evidence of their fate? These questions have not been answered, and as time passes, the likelihood of them ever being answered seems to diminish. Chapter 11. The Wider Implications. The Ashford case raises questions that extend beyond the specific circumstances of that night in 1987. It raises questions about the nature of investigation itself, about the limits of our ability to understand and explain certain phenomena. Throughout human history, there have been accounts of people vanishing without a trace, of events that seem to violate the normal rules of physics and causality. Most of these accounts are dismissed as folklore, myth, or the product of misunderstanding or misrepresentation. But the Ashford case, well documented, extensively investigated, witnessed by credible observers, does not fit neatly into these categories. It remains possible that there is a rational explanation for the disappearance of the 5 Ashford children that has simply not yet been discovered or properly articulated. It remains possible that future forensic developments or new evidence could shed light on the mystery, but it also remains possible that the disappearance of the 5 children represents a genuine anomaly, an event that falls outside the normal parameters of human experience and our ability to explain it. What makes the case particularly poignant is that it involves the loss of 5 young people who had their entire lives ahead of them. Thomas would have been 52 years old in 2025 had he survived. Margaret would have been 50 years old. James would have been 48. Catherine would have been 46. David would have been 41. They would have completed their educations. They would have pursued careers. They would have presumably had families of their own. They would have lived the normal arc of human life: childhood, adolescence, adulthood, perhaps even grandparenthood by now. Instead, they exist only in photographs and in memory, their lives suspended forever at the point of their disappearance. Chapter 12. The Conclusion. As of this writing, in the year 2025, the case of the 5 Ashford children remains unsolved. No new information has emerged in recent years. The official investigation was closed decades ago. The alternative investigations by amateur researchers and paranormal enthusiasts have failed to produce definitive answers. What we are left with is a mystery. A genuine, unexplained mystery involving the disappearance of 5 young people under circumstances that seem to defy rational explanation. The Ashford fire of December 24, 1987, remains one of the most puzzling and tragic unsolved cases in the history of Connecticut law enforcement. It serves as a reminder of the limits of our understanding, of the possibility that reality contains phenomena that we cannot explain, of the fragility of human life, and the sudden, absolute nature of loss. Eleanor and Robert Ashford died that night. Their 5 children, Thomas, Margaret, James, Catherine, and David, disappeared. Whether they are truly gone, or whether they exist somewhere in circumstances that we can only speculate about, may forever remain one of the great unsolved mysteries of modern times.